Hello again. At 11 o'clock in the morning of November the 11th, 1918, the Armistice began, which ended the fighting of the Great War, which is, of course, why we mark November the 11th each year as Armistice Day. It's not such a big event as once it was. I doubt if traffic will pull over and stop at 11 o'clock today, or even pedestrians stand still for a couple of minutes to remember those who died during that war. The modern view, which is taught in schools, is that the men who died were hapless dupes, driven to their deaths by uncaring senior officers like Field Marshal Haig. This is, of course, a fairly new idea, one which appeared more or less fully formed in 1961 and has now become the accepted orthodoxy. Before that time, we all had great admiration for those men who died on the Western Front, and most people regarded Haig as one of the greatest military figures of the 20th century. We have, however, been indoctrinated into despising him and feeling that the sacrifice of those soldiers was in vain. When Field Marshal Douglas Haig, by that time an earl, died in 1928, his funeral was the occasion of an outpouring of national grief comparable in scale and intensity to the mourning which followed Princess Diana's death in 1997. Hundreds of thousands of people, many of them former soldiers, lined the route of his funeral cortege. There would be nothing like it again until the funeral of Winston Churchill in 1965. Whoever else might criticise Haig, he was beloved by the men who had served under him. The name Douglas became very popular in Britain during the 1920s, as old soldiers named their sons after their former commander-in-chief. Seldom was a public figure so loved and respected by ordinary people. The idea of Haig as a heartless butcher certainly didn't originate with the soldiers who had actually fought at the Battle of the Somme. My own grandfather, who fought in all the great battles on the Western Front, adored Haig. In 1961, a young historian called Alan Clark published a book called The Donkeys, which portrayed Haig and his army colleagues as being cold-blooded and uncaring, wishing to win the war at whatever cost in human lives. The title was a reference to a supposed conversation between the German generals Ludendorff and Hoffmann during the war. Ludendorff was said to have remarked to Hoffmann that the English soldiers fought like lions, to which the other man replied, "True, but don't we know that they are lions led by donkeys?" It's doubtful if this exchange ever really took place. Alan Clark was very cagey about his source for the quotation, and it may be regarded as apocryphal. It's not in any case an original idea. Writing 2,000 years ago, Plutarch observed that an army of deer commanded by a lion is more to be feared than an army of lions led by a deer. There had been criticism before of Haig's conduct of the war and also the way in which his fellow generals seemed unable to adapt to the changing conditions of modern warfare. Clark's book, The Donkeys, and the thesis which it advanced might have passed unnoticed by the general public had it not been, improbably enough, turned into a musical, a rare event indeed for a non-fiction work of military history. Perhaps it is something of an exaggeration to say that The Donkeys became a musical, but not much. There's a good deal of truth in the idea. A little over 18 months after the publication of Clark's book, a new musical opened at the Theatre Royal in East London. Developed by Joan Littlewood, Oh What a Lovely War featured many of the most famous musical songs from the First World War. This was no exercise in nostalgia, though. It was rather a savage denunciation of the British generals, including, of course, Haig. The soldiers in the production wore pirouette costumes, lending them a grotesque and ridiculous appearance. The portrayal of Haig was so offensive to some that his family made strenuous efforts to stop the show being transferred to the West End, where it would, of course, be seen by far greater audiences than was the case in the little theatre in East London where it had opened. In 1969, Oh What a Lovely War was turned into a major film, starring John Gielgud, Laurence Olivier, Vanessa Redgrave and Kenneth More. This cemented in the public mind the notion of Haig and the other generals as clown-like and out-of-touch figures who were responsible because of their foolish and blinkered attitudes for much of the carnage on the Western Front. Of course, in the 1960s, it was recognised that books like The Donkeys, along with the film of Oh What a Lovely War, really represented radical and revisionist views of the First World War. They were daring and they ran counter to the generally accepted interpretation of the war. By the 1970s, though, this revisionist perspective on a major event in British history had somehow become, in the public mind at least, the orthodox version of history. Since then, this myth has been massively reinforced by another piece of popular culture, a satirical television comedy set during the period and starring Rowan Atkinson. Incredibly, episodes of this situation comedy are now widely used in secondary schools for teaching the history of the First World War. In the autumn of 1989, the fourth and final series of the popular historical sitcom Blackadder was aired by the BBC. Blackadder Goes Forth was set in a trench on the Western Front during the First World War and showed how Captain Edmund Blackadder, played by Rowan Atkinson, attempted to survive the war by means of various stratagems. A key figure in the drama was Tony Robinson, playing Blackadder's hapless batman, Private Baldrick. Baldrick is the archetypal everyman, a simple person caught up in events of which he has little understanding and over which he is able to exercise no control at all. On the face of it, his character and position are in sharp contrast to the well-educated officer whom he serves. But as the series progresses, it becomes apparent that both are merely pawns in the machinations of various senior officers, obvious fools, who have no regard at all for the lives of the troops under their command. Needless to say, General Haig makes an appearance. Part of the appeal of Blackadder Goes Forth lies in the way that both Blackadder and Baldrick are shown to be little men, each struggling in their own way to overcome authority. They do this not by fighting openly against those above them, but rather by various cunning plans. It was perhaps his appeal to the ancient mythic archetype of the little person using craftiness and subtlety against superiors, rather than open rebellion, which made the programme such a success. There are echoes here of Yaroslav Hašek's First World War classic, The Good Soldier Švec. Within a very few years, Blackadder Goes Forth was being treated not as an extravagant fantasy, but as a realistic parody of the actual situation of ordinary soldiers at the time that the comedy was set. True, it was wildly exaggerated and grotesque, but the actual premise upon which it was based, the thesis advanced by both Alan Clark and Joan Littlewood in the 1960s, was assumed by viewers to be historically accurate. This was a truly extraordinary situation that a controversial minority perception of an important period of British history had been shaped by a musical and its film adaptation and was now treated universally as being the correct view of the past. A new offensive on the Western Front was described in Blackadder in these terms: Haig is about to make yet another gargantuan effort to move his drinks cabinet 6 inches closer to Berlin. The transformation of General Haig as he was in 1916, from revered national hero to blundering butcher, was now complete. Episodes of the BBC comedy are regularly shown to school pupils studying history for GCSE, and a new generation are thus indoctrinated with the myth of the British generals of that period. My own view is that Haig was indeed a great man, and the men under his command were heroes. The least we can do is spend 2 minutes remembering them at 11 o'clock today.